In watching tragedies of the Ukrainian war this past month on the news, I've been reminded how close Disney came to creating the pavilion that would have celebrated not only Russia as a country, but Russia's centuries-long connection with Ukraine. And such a pavilion would have placed the resort in a difficult position. The story of the Soviet and later Russian pavilion starts in the mid-1970s and then plays out in the early 1990s. But it's not the only significant political story that shaped EPCOT pavilions during its early years. On the podcast today, 3 unlikely stories of how international politics shaped World Showcase, the story of what happens when an entertainment company ventures into the world of foreign relations. To set up this first story, I need to contextualize the moment. In the 1950s, Disney established its rules for what theme space delivered. Theme space delivered the visual environment of a movie. Frontierland presented the environments of westerns, Main Street presented the environment of a historical drama. Adventureland delivered the experience of a jungle picture, such as those in the Tarzan series. Tomorrowland delivered an environment that included the visual tropes of near-future science fiction, and of course Fantasyland delivered the realm of the animated feature. Shortly after Disneyland opened, Walt wanted to repurpose how the tools of Hollywood set design might present something other than the world of film in his theme park. He was interested in creating international villages in the area that's now occupied by the Matterhorn and Submarine Voyage. We've talked about this in other podcasts. He was also interested in creating historic squares that presented the history of the United States, such as Liberty Street, Edison Square, Rivertown, and New Orleans Square. Back in the 1950s, long before its deep focus on ghosts and pirates, New Orleans Square was designed as an area to present the story of the Louisiana Purchase. We've also talked about that on previous podcasts as well. But very little of this was built during Walt's lifetime, largely because no companies were willing to sponsor it. A different version of New Orleans Square was built in the mid-1960s, shortly before Walt's passing, and after his death, an abbreviated version of Liberty Street, now called Liberty Square, opened in 1971 with the Florida Resort. But for the most part, theme space in a Disney park to the average person meant the world of movies. In the 1970s, as Disney worked to create World Showcase, first as a standalone international village near the Ticket and Transportation Center, and then later as one half of the EPCOT project, executives would need to convince government officials and financial managers of large companies that not only could Disney use the tools of Hollywood set design to create cultural pavilions, but that these pavilions would interest a large audience. Initially, Disney had hopes of creating a world showcase with about 24 countries represented. But they quickly discovered that very few government officials and financial managers shared their optimism that the public would be just as interested in visiting a cultural pavilion based on Germany or Japan as they were in visiting a castle that opened to the fairy tale world of Snow White and Peter Pan. And this is the context for much of what we have today. A set of political problems that surrounded EPCOT as it developed and later tried to expand. A set of very complex policy and perception concerns that Disney stumbled into as it tried to replicate the cultural experience of individual countries. And so, to begin our stories for today, we loop back to those mostly forgotten plans for what would have been the Soviet pavilion, ideas that later evolved into a Russia pavilion. In the 1970s, among the first group of international dignitaries to explore the possibility of a World Showcase pavilion is a lone delegate from the Soviet Union, Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. According to Disney manager Charlie Ridgway, the Russian government forbade him from bringing his wife, likely to limit his ability to defect, but he was allowed to bring his granddaughter. When Disney World marketing executive Jack Lindquist and Disney World Vice President Bob Allen picked him up from the airport, they told him how a monorail would pass through the hotel where he and his granddaughter were staying. "I know all about the monorail system," he said. "We have the greatest monorail system in Russia." They then drove him over to the Contemporary Hotel. But Lindquist noticed how he responded when he saw monorails on twin beams moving through the building. Quote, "When he actually saw the monorail pass through the lobby, his mouth dropped. We didn't hear anything about how great the Russian monorails were after that." In a later point in these discussions, Dobrynin was hosted by former Mercury astronaut Gordon Cooper and his wife. In the mid-1970s, long after his career at NASA was over, Cooper took a research and development job with Disney as Imagineering developed ideas that would later form EPCOT Center. Cooper was chosen as a host, as he'd be able to discuss the long-standing rivalry between space programs in the U.S. and the USSR. He took the Russian ambassador through the Magic Kingdom. Quote, "They were enjoying it all thoroughly," Cooper recalled, "and there was the very stern Dobrynin strolling through Fantasyland with 2 balloons wearing a set of Mickey Mouse ears." At the time, the Soviet Union was the largest country in the world, a collection of 15 republics. But plans for a Soviet pavilion at EPCOT never materialized in the 1970s. For a while, in the late 1970s, Disney held talks with Poland in the hopes that Poland might represent that region of the world. But those talks never produced much either. Bob Allen, vice president of Walt Disney World, would later explain that discussions with Russia continued on and off for years. In 1983, he said, quote, "We went down to the wire with them. We backed off mutually when things got tense." Allen explained that new political tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union complicated the prospects of a pavilion both for Disney and for the Soviets. 2 years later, in 1985, the newly hired managerial team at Disney, Michael Eisner and Frank Wells, tried to restart talks with the Soviets for a pavilion. Eisner said that the Soviets are, quote, "invited to come forward with a USSR pavilion." He indicated that Disney would, quote, "like to leave politics at the front gate," meaning that a pavilion would be focused on culture, art, architecture, and cuisine of the region. This invitation slowly got the process moving again. By the summer of 1987, Stephen Reinsmith, who was the coordinator of the president's U.S.-Soviet exchange initiative, confirmed that early talks were in progress between Disney and the Soviets, with the U.S. government included in the negotiations, though again the process moved slowly. In October of that year, the Soviets sent a team of 30 agricultural experts to the U.S. to better understand how experimental growing techniques in America might aid Soviet farms. As part of that trip, these experts spent over 2 hours walking through the land pavilion at EPCOT and talking with researchers who worked there. But while they were on property, Dick Nunes took the opportunity to talk with them about the possibility of a Soviet pavilion and World Showcase. Nunes suggested that they encourage Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union, to consider developing a cultural pavilion. After the team left, Nunes explained, quote, "A pavilion would be 3 or 4 years down the road. We talked about it, and now we have shown the Soviets the value of this place. Today they saw firsthand the very essence of what we do." Still, the process moved slowly. In December 1989, Disney, quote, "made a presentation to Soviet officials who were in Orlando to view a Soviet-sponsored cultural exhibit unrelated to Disney. This presentation went well. 1 month later, in January 1989, Disney CEO Michael Eisner explained that, quote, "negotiations with Soviet officials have been taking place for years, and an agreement on a Soviet pavilion at EPCOT Center is near." 1 year later, talks between Disney and the Soviets were focused on preliminary artwork. In February 1990, a company representative confirmed, quote, "we have only vague renderings, onion dome spires, that kind of thing." During this period, as the Soviet Union was beginning to fall away with individual republics seceding from the Union by popular vote, Russia found itself in a position of new authority. Russia effectively took over roles held by the former Soviet Union. It accepted all debts once held by the now-dissolved Soviet Union and claimed all overseas properties once owned by the Union as well. With this, a new opportunity emerged from the remains of that original Soviet pavilion to create a pavilion mostly focused on Russia, showcasing its history and culture, and to some extent the history of the Soviet Union. Negotiations were led in part by Russian businessperson Boris Breyev, an owner of a copper mine. In the early 1990s, he explained, quote, 5 years ago, it was impossible to do these things. Just impossible. Now it's not exactly a free market in Russia, but it's going to be. By this, he was suggesting that individual companies would have a larger voice in national expression in the same way that companies from other regions sponsored pavilions at EPCOT. Mitsukoshi, for example, was the sponsor of the Japan Pavilion. Or perhaps as a better example, multiple companies and the Norway government co-funded the Norway Pavilion. The results of these talks was a plan for a massive $130 million pavilion, with the venture split 50-50 between Disney and interests in Russia. In the early 1990s, including a period after the dissolution of the USSR, Disney and Russia developed the pavilion through concept art, show design, and an extremely detailed model. World Showcase had multiple expansion pads remaining around the lagoon. Undoubtedly, the Russian pavilion was considered for different pads, but in a 1992 presentation video, the pavilion is shown in the open space next to Germany. This pad has a good deal of depth, which may have been important. It also may have been useful to place it fairly close to the American pavilion, but more on that in a second. Some pavilions, such as France, showcase the architecture of a single city, but most of the pavilions present an amalgam of architecture from across the region. This was the plan here. Domes and spires of St. Basil's Cathedral were mixed with brick walls and archways of Red Square. In a separate section of the pavilion would exist an old-world hamlet of smaller structures made from wood. The pavilion would have two large attractions. The first attraction would be arranged in an 800-seat theater set in the Red Square section of the pavilion. Here guests would see a show called Russia, the Bells of Change, similar to the American Adventure, with multiple stages of animatronics and film-based sections that offered images on large screens. The presentation would begin with Russia's early history 1,000 years ago in Kiev. Kiev would give rise over centuries and various wars to both Ukraine and Russia. The presentation would depict the coronation of a medieval czar, the revolution in the early 20th century, and Soviet achievements in space exploration. And if the show was housed near the American Adventure, the two shows could probably share a set of on-property technicians. Beyond this show, in the area arranged as the Wooded Village, guests would find a dark ride that told the story of a Russian fairy tale, which Disney called Ivan and the Magic Pike. The story in Russia, though, is called either At the Pike's Behest or Amelia the Simpleton, and the main character is Amelia, though perhaps Disney felt that Ivan was a more identifiable name for a Western audience for a young Russian character. The story is about a lazy boy, Amelia or Ivan, whichever you like, who finds a magic fish, the pike, who grants him wishes. In the story, the boy travels across Russia as he's ordered to demonstrate his ability to the Tsar. And this generally would be the framework for the story told on the EPCOT Dark Ride. This would be a ride in which the ride vehicle, at least in some of the art, would be a Russian sled. Elsewhere in the pavilion would be the usual table service restaurant, shops, and exhibit space for Russian art. In the summer of 1992, Disney was so confident in these plans that it made preliminary announcements in materials directed at longtime fans. In Disney Magazine, for example, the company announced the Russia Pavilion was on WDI's figurative, quote, drawing boards, though the project was actually long past the drawing stage and was now represented in multiple models. Quote, an innovative theater presentation, The Bells of Change, the magazine announced, will chronicle Russian history not only on film but via large animated sets, which can transform the theater itself into various settings, such as 16th century Kiev at a time of the first Tsar's coronation. Also planned is a dark ride. At this point, industry insiders estimated that an opening target date would hover between 1995 and the late 90s, though nothing official was announced. But as Russia faced economic challenges in the 1990s, this pavilion was never built, even though it was deeply designed down to the movement of each attraction. Even in the late 1990s, this pavilion may have caused political problems for Disney, but those problems would be nothing compared to the problems such a pavilion would face today during the time of the war in Ukraine. But this wasn't the only time that Disney narrowly sidestepped political difficulties with a pavilion that was fully designed but not built. There was, back in the late 1970s, the Iranian Pavilion. According to Charlie Ridgway, in the early and mid-1970s, the Empress of Iran, quote, frequently visited Walt Disney World. In fact, she was there so often that Ridgway dined with her at the Empress Lily, which is now called Paddlefish, down at what was then called the shopping village of Lake Buena Vista. Her interest in the Disney resort then set up a strong possibility for an Iranian pavilion in World Showcase. For World Showcase pavilions, agreements went through multiple stages: a non-binding agreement to explore pavilion possibilities, the funding for artwork and a later model, and then finally a full agreement to develop an actual pavilion at EPCOT Center. In the late 1970s, Disney began talks with the Shah of Iran to develop a pavilion in EPCOT, with Harper Goff as the lead art director. Not only had Goff worked on some of the earliest designs for Disney World and Disneyland, before coming to Disney he had created live-action sets at Warner Brothers representing the Middle East and had a reasonable feel for the style and culture of the region. Quote, "We wanted to develop something to take over to see the Shah," Goff said, "so I developed that, which was a startling and exciting show, I thought. And we didn't have a ride on it because we understood he didn't like that kind of thing, the carny atmosphere. He wanted it kind of a walkthrough and very respectful of the history of Iran and the Persian people, and particularly his dynasty and everything like that." Goff believed that with his experience at Warner Brothers, he would be able to use architecture to represent the Persian culture of Iran so that it was visually and easily distinct from other pavilions representing that region of the world, such as a possible pavilion featuring Morocco. In 1978, Jack Lindquist and others flew to Tehran to formalize plans with the royal family, which included the Empress. They arrived to learn that the royal family had just left for an impromptu ski trip to Switzerland, but the team then settled into what was termed the palace. Quote, "Much to my surprise, I found the palace to be a disappointment," Lindquist said. "It wasn't anything grandiose like palaces of the Western world. Instead, this place could have been Standard Oil's headquarters for all I knew. The setup was more like a business with large offices and conference rooms." By the time the Shah's party returned, the Disney team had set up the model and accompanying artwork to depict how the Iranian Pavilion would appear at EPCOT Center. The model was 4 feet by 3 feet and about 2 feet high, based on artwork originally overseen by Harper Goff. It showcased modern Iran, but also included exhibits that explored its long history. The Disney team eventually stayed in Tehran for 6 weeks, visiting the opera, various museums, and discussing plans with the royal family. After dinner in the palace, they watched as dishwashers took the plates and silverware down to a local river to clean them in the current. They visited a bazaar established in the 18th century where one shop owner boasted that his carpets piled 10 feet high were worth over $100 million. At another stall, one Disney executive was horrified when a butcher slit the throat of a lamb for a customer, then gutted and skinned it on a public-facing table before wrapping the package as meat. Eventually, the team met with the Minister of Oil and Natural Resources to discuss money. They explained that the investment to have a pavilion would be about $20 million, which for the Shah of Iran was not a concern. By the time they left, they believed that EPCOT Center would likely hold an Iranian pavilion. This, of course, all fell apart the following year, in 1979, during the revolution that ousted the Shah and installed the new government. A group of militarized college students took over the U.S. Embassy and held 52 diplomats and U.S. citizens hostage for over a year. But in a slightly different universe, one where Disney opened EPCOT a couple of years earlier as originally planned, Disney might have found itself in the very difficult position of having an Iranian pavilion that commemorated the Shah's version of Iran, while a very different version of Iran was taking shape with dozens of Americans being held hostage there. This pavilion ended with detailed plans and a model, but nothing more. But beyond the Iran pavilion, there was that time that Disney was blindsided by a country's announcement that they would be featured in World Showcase, an announcement that caused actual political problems. In the late 1970s, the Disney team planned out a lagoon with 21 pads for pavilions. They created a model that showcased how likely countries would be configured around the water. These countries included Israel, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Costa Rica, Holland, Switzerland, Australia, along with a lot of countries that actually showed up, such as France, the UK, Germany, Italy, and so on. During a particularly optimistic period, Disney even considered ways to expand beyond these 21 pads in case more countries were interested. This would be accomplished by creating a second lagoon area behind the America Pavilion. At one point, Disney thought about possibly shifting Australia with a scaled-down version of the Sydney Opera House and the Sydney Harbour Bridge over to this second lagoon if necessary to visually anchor the area. As you probably know, Disney found instead that it was very difficult to sign countries to a multi-year contract that cost over time tens of millions of dollars. When EPCOT opened, World Showcase had just 9 countries. Even today it has only 11. But back in the late 1970s, when this model was arranged for viewing, and it was a massive model, many feet long, depicting future World Showcase, the parking lot, and the surrounding road system, some of those final 9 countries were missing. The most interesting exclusion was China. Instead of mainland China, that is, the People's Republic of China, this model included its military rival, Taiwan, or the Republic of China. For most of the 1970s, the United States recognized Taiwan as an independent country and held diplomatic relations with it. The U.S. had an embassy in Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, and Taiwan had an embassy in Washington, D.C., while the U.S. did not have an embassy with mainland China. During this period, Disney Imagineers explored the possibility of a Taiwan pavilion with government officials. In that early model of World Showcase, the Taiwan Pavilion was fitted next to Australia, just down the way from Germany, not far from where China stands today. It included a temple, a tall circular pagoda, a garden area, and behind a line of trees, a show building for a yet-to-be-determined attraction. Since 1954, the U.S. had engaged in a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan and was then stationing American troops on its land. But in 1977 and 1978, the U.S. reconsidered its relationship with Taiwan as part of what was then called the question of the two Chinas, specifically with which China should the U.S. align itself. On February 1, 1978, as reported in the New York Times, the U.S. envoy in Beijing voiced that the U.S. was likely, in his opinion, to acknowledge the People's Republic of China rather than Taiwan in the coming months. The envoy, Leonard Woodstock, believed, quote, the U.S. would find the courage necessary to withdraw its recognition of Taiwan and establish full diplomatic ties with Communist China. He further explained that it was a military necessity, especially if war broke out again in the Pacific, that the U.S. have, quote, a full and normal relationship between the world's most populous power, meaning mainland China. On that very same day, the 1st of February, almost surely in a move to strengthen its presence in the United States, Taiwan, without first discussing the matter with Disney, publicly announced that after some initial talks and preliminary designs, they were finalizing their sponsorship of a pavilion in World Showcase. The announcement was made by H.K. Shao, Director General of the Board of Foreign Trade for Taiwan, who was visiting the United States as part of a 26-member delegation of government and business officials. For the press, he explained that Taiwan would invest $10 million to create, quote, a permanent exhibit featuring life in nationalist China, meaning Taiwan, within the World Showcase portion of EPCOT. He also explained that beyond that $10 million, Taiwan expected businesses in his country to participate in the pavilion, likely with stores, restaurants, and other services. In other words, the government would put in $10 million, and private businesses, as with other EPCOT pavilions, were being arranged to contribute the rest for the privilege of having shops and a restaurant or two in the park. Disney executives found out about the announcement from reporters. Aware of the evolving political issues between the U.S., China, and Taiwan, they were unprepared to respond, though also understood that a response was necessary. On the one hand, they didn't want to offend Taiwan, one of the few countries interested in a World Showcase pavilion space, and on the other hand, they didn't want to embroil themselves in a political showdown shaping up between the U.S. and the two Chinas. Vice President of Marketing Jack Lindquist was given the task to speak for the company. He did his best to create a statement that would offend no one, yet also leave Disney open to as many options as possible. Lindquist said, quote, we're surprised and delighted to hear the news. But then he also explained that Disney itself wasn't ready to make an official statement, as they hoped to announce all participating countries at the same time. He confirmed that Disney had been in talks with Taiwan for many months, but Disney itself had not yet been contacted by Taiwanese government officials with their plans to finalize the contract. 8 months later, Disney announced 10 countries with whom they had signed a letter of intent to develop a pavilion. These included Mexico, Japan, West Germany, Morocco, Canada, Israel, the UK, France, Italy, and the United Arab Emirates. Some of these arrangements would fall apart or be significantly delayed before EPCOT opened in 1982. Noticeably missing from the list was Taiwan. But aside from the United States, the host country, this list included all countries whose pavilions opened with the park, except one. In December 1978, President Carter diplomatically acknowledged China and put forward a plan to close the U.S. Embassy in Taiwan and open one in Beijing. By the start of 1979, Disney was refocused on China, meaning the People's Republic of China, rather than on Taiwan for a possible pavilion. In February, Disney executives gave the chief liaison between China and the U.S., Han Zhu, a tour of the Magic Kingdom and a presentation about EPCOT. Together, they explored smaller cultural exchange projects instead of a full pavilion. For example, Disney suggested that they loan their America on Parade floats and performers to China in exchange for a lengthy visit from a Chinese circus at EPCOT. Bob Allen commented that he didn't think that China was ready yet, quote, to invest the large amount of money that would be required for the pavilion project. But a China pavilion, or at least some element that represented Chinese culture, was still seen as a significant point of promotion for the upcoming park. Until 1974, China was essentially closed to tourism. After 1974, a few sites in China were open to Western tourists, but general tourism beyond these sites required travel permits from government agencies, ensuring that hardly anyone visited them. Because of these restrictions, hardly anyone in the U.S. had seen China in person. By the middle of 1979, EPCOT was moving through the early stages of construction. As a lagoon was being fashioned, Disney was surprised to see that China might possibly be interested in creating a pavilion, or at least in culturally supporting such a pavilion. Whereas most announcements for World Showcase came out of the Florida-based team, announcements about China were handled by the president of Walt Disney Productions, Card Walker. In January 1980, he explained, quote, I've been in contact with top Chinese officials, and I'm optimistic that we'll have a China pavilion in a later phase of our project. Plans at this time also included the possibility of a film presentation about China, with government officials heavily supervising the proposed production that would show regions in China never glimpsed by Western visitors. By early 1981, Disney had made cultural, if not financial, progress. Charlie Ridgway explained, quote, we have the support of mainland China, but not a participating sponsor. Essentially, China was agreeing to be represented, but wasn't yet willing to financially support the project. Quote, but there's a strong possibility, Ridgway continued, we'll build it anyway. In the spring, Disney was scouting locations for a Circle Vision film. In-house, the film was initially described as a Chinese version of the Disney film America the Beautiful, to the point that it was casually called China the Beautiful in some company documents. It would be eventually released as The Wonders of China. With this, plans moved ahead for a China pavilion, with input from representatives of the Chinese government through its embassy in Washington, D.C. Disney hoped that at least the movie would be ready for the park's opening in October 1982. Eventually, the Disney company would find presentation and co-investment help from James Ying, whose company had arranged Chinese cultural exhibits for the 1982 World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee, and another gentleman with experience at the fair, Ken Poon, who formed a company specifically to manage the food service areas and the retail shops within the EPCOT Pavilion. Both Ying and Poon were American citizens with long-standing connections to Chinese officials. In essence, Disney was transferring the management team from the Chinese exhibit and restaurant at the Knoxville Fair to EPCOT. It would be the most unusual configuration of sponsorships in World Showcase, with Disney participating far more than in other pavilions, primarily to present a picture of a communist country that most of the world had never seen. And this, perhaps, more than anything, depicts how deeply Disney wanted to create a pavilion focused on Chinese architecture, art, and culture inside of its park. Another problem management faced was hiring workers for the pavilion. Though other pavilions would be staffed by cultural representatives from the host country, such as France, Italy, and Canada, it would prove extremely difficult for citizens from a communist country to work inside of the U.S. without a significant lead time to arrange visas and clear the work through government offices. As a temporary solution, in 1982, ads were placed in Chinese-language newspapers in the U.S. seeking American citizens born in China who were interested in positions at EPCOT. A dinner was also arranged in Orlando for local residents who had immigrated from China. As for China itself, the country would send singers, dancers, and other performers for EPCOT's grand opening in October, though these were arranged under a cultural exchange program. And by the following year, Disney was exploring plans to include students from the People's Republic of China at the pavilion in what was then called the World Showcase Fellowship Program. In 1984, plans were finalized to bring 7 students from the People's Republic of China to work at EPCOT, beginning in mid-September. In short, though the pavilion opened with the rest of the park, Disney spent 2 years attempting to restructure the China Pavilion so that its inner workings were more in line with other pavilions. During these years, Disney also explored options to develop food areas beyond the initial work done by Ying and Poon. One would think that by the time the park opened, Taiwan's interest in EPCOT would simply recede. But that's not what happened. Taiwan apparently still wanted to announce its presence to the world alongside the People's Republic of China in another way. 5 months after EPCOT opened, Taiwan sent a gift to the city of Orlando, a 12.5-ton presentation of natural marble, quote, sculpted by the winds in the mountains of their country. It was 4 feet high and 20 feet long, like a dark brown tree weathered by age, resting on its side. It arrived in Orlando on April 21, 1983. The gift was officially an offering from Taiwan to Orlando after its mayor visited the previous year. But a plaque on the stone announced its intended purpose. Quote, "It is hoped that this piece of marble can be placed at a permanent location in your great Walt Disney World." And this, once more, placed Disney in an awkward political position, essentially receiving a gift to be displayed in EPCOT, the most logical place for an international gift, from a country that China believed was part of its territory. In case there was any confusion about the exact intent, T.H. Lin of Taiwan's Coordinated Council for North American Affairs explained that, in his estimation, quote, "The stone was designed for Taiwan to keep a hand in the World Showcase area of EPCOT." Disney did their best to craft a response that avoided politics, though clearly politics surrounded the gift. Instead of refusing the gift in deference to the People's Republic of China and the pavilion already on the Disney Lagoon, Bob Mervine, a Disney publicist, explained to the public that, quote, "The rock was meant as a gift to the city of Orlando. We're not the city of Orlando. We don't feel it's appropriate to display it at all at Walt Disney World." In terms of geography, Disney World was a good 10 miles technically from the city of Orlando. For the rest of May, the 12-ton piece of marble remained in a city garage. In June, Orlando announced plans to display the rock at Lake Eola. They would create a new cement pad and show area in their existing gardens, where the long rock would be displayed upright, standing like a petrified tree. For its part, Taiwan was just fine with that display site and sent a new plaque to dedicate the marble, removing the part about how it was originally intended for Walt Disney World. I'll be back next week with a new episode that explores a few more stories about EPCOT. This time, I'm pretty sure, about coffee, shoes, and some other things. And after posting our first AGD episode in a long time last Sunday, I added a second short AGD episode over on Bandcamp yesterday. Last week, in our episode on the Animal Kingdom area, we looked at 4 backstage tours presently offered. There's a 5th backstage tour at the resort that has recently reopened over at the Magic Kingdom. We look at that and stories around this tour in this episode. If you're listening on Bandcamp right now, it's the episode right behind this one. And for those of you who are listening on other platforms such as iTunes, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, please support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.